Is controversy the secret to longevity in fashion?
It was jeans that put us on the map. And it was Brooke Shields saying, you know what comes between me and my Calvins? Nothing.
Calvin Klein built an empire on minimalism, provocation, and marketing genius. Jeans, underwear, fragrance, each one turned into a cultural phenomenon. This was the brand that didn't just sell jeans, it sold scandal, and the world bought it. But behind the dominance, Calvin Klein has always been a story of extremes, of campaigns that pushed too far, of a brand that seemed untouchable in the 90s, only to lose its footing in the decades that followed, and of a comeback attempt today under a new creative director that has everyone wondering if the magic can really be recaptured. To understand where Calvin Klein stands in 2025, we have to go back to the provocative campaigns, the controversies, the billion-dollar takeover, and the moment the brand's identity started to slip. Calvin Klein wasn't born into the world of Paris couture or old-money ateliers. He grew up in the Bronx, sketching clothes in his notebooks and learning the basics in his grandmother's tailor shop. In 1968, with a $10,000 loan and his childhood friend Barry Schwartz at his side, Klein launched his label. The designs were clean and minimal, but minimal didn't mean boring. From the start, Klein's real genius wasn't just clothes, it was image. He knew how to make simplicity feel sexy, how to turn restraint into desire. By the late 1970s, the brand had found its weapon, jeans. In 1978, Calvin Klein denim hit stores, and within a week more than 200,000 pairs were sold. It wasn't that jeans were new, it was that Calvin sold them like they were luxury. Denim suddenly had status. 2 years later, he doubled down on provocation. In 1980, 15-year-old Brooke Shields leaned into the camera and said the line that would define the decade. You want to know what comes between me and my Calvins? Nothing. Overnight, the campaign was everywhere. The outrage was instant. Accusations of exploitation, politicians condemning it, parents calling for boycotts. But the scandal only supercharged sales. Overnight, Calvin Klein jeans weren't just denim. They became a cultural flashpoint, proof that controversy could be the best marketing of all. Through the 80s and 90s, the formula repeated itself. Kate Moss and Mark Wahlberg's stripped-down underwear ads in 1992 were raw, sweaty, and provocatively intimate, which was exactly the point. The 1995 campaign that looked like it was shot in some grimy basement went so far that the U.S. Justice Department opened an inquiry. Within days, the ads were pulled. But even that only made the brand more notorious. At the same time, Calvin Klein was expanding into fragrance and rewriting the rules there too. In 1994, CK1 launched as the first unisex perfume on a mass scale. The ads were simple, black and white, with androgynous youth packed together like a cult. It was fresh, bold, and completely of the moment. CK1 became a bestseller and a generational symbol, proof that the Calvin machine wasn't just about clothes. By the mid-1990s, Calvin Klein wasn't a fashion brand. It was a cultural language. Black and white ads, provocative taglines, impossibly thin models. It all became shorthand for American cool. Calvin himself summed up the mission. He wanted his clothes to be to die for, and for a time, they were. For all the buzz Calvin Klein generated in the 80s and 90s, the business itself was more fragile than it looked. The ads were famous, the shows were glamorous, the fragrances were cash cows, but the clothes? They weren't always profitable. Couture-level ideas attached to ready-to-wear didn't scale the way jeans and underwear did. By the late 90s, the industry was shifting. Minimalism, once Calvin's domain, was being redefined by designers like Helmut Lang and Jill Sander. Klein's signature provocation started to feel less daring and more predictable. Consumers still bought the jeans and fragrances, but the high-fashion aura around the brand was slipping. Calvin himself was burning out. After 3 decades of running the house, he admitted he was tired of always chasing the next big thing, of making everyone else look incredible while he felt boxed in. In 2002, he sold the company to PVH Corp., the same group behind Tommy Hilfiger. It was a billion-dollar deal that secured Calvin's legacy, but also marked the end of an era. PVH had the money and infrastructure to grow the brand globally, but what it didn't have was Calvin. The founder stayed on as a consultant, but he no longer called the shots. And when your entire brand is built on the vision of one man, that absence shows quickly. The years that followed were defined by experiments, some bold, some disastrous. Designers came and went, each one trying to capture the Calvin Klein DNA and failing in different ways. Marketing leaned harder on nostalgia, recycling the old black and white aesthetic with younger faces, but it didn't have the same impact. By the early 2010s, Calvin Klein ads looked less like cultural statements and more like parodies of the old ones. The most famous reset came in 2016, when PVH brought in Raf Simons as chief creative officer. It was a huge industry move. Simons was one of fashion's most respected designers, with a cult following. His appointment was hailed as the one that might restore Calvin Klein's prestige. At first, the hype was electric. His debut shows were sharp, cinematic, and critically praised. He rebranded the Runway line, a high-concept title referencing the brand's headquarters. The clothes were artful, intellectual, and drenched in Americana. Plastic coats, reworked quilts, Andy Warhol prints splashed across dresses. The critics loved it. But for the average Calvin Klein customer, the clothes were too niche, too expensive, too intellectual. Meanwhile, the brand's core lines, jeans and underwear, were leaning into safe celebrity endorsements. Justin Bieber's underwear campaign went viral in 2015, but by 2017, the buzz felt forced. The disconnect was obvious. Raf Simons was chasing critical prestige, while the commercial side leaned on influencers to sell basics. It was two Calvins, speaking to two completely different audiences. Sales tanked, and by 2018, Raf was out. PVH explained his departure by saying his vision was not aligned with the commercial direction of the brand, a reminder of just how wide the gap had grown between Calvin Klein's high-fashion ambitions and its mass-market reality. Calvin Klein had gone from setting the cultural agenda to chasing it. The brand that once shocked the world suddenly felt like background noise at the mall. After Raf Simons' exit and the shelving of the collection line, Calvin Klein retreated to the categories that had always kept the business afloat. The runway was gone, but underwear, jeans, and fragrance carried on. These lines had long been the brand's real engine. The logo waistband became a kind of cultural shorthand, instantly recognizable, endlessly marketable. Jeans, too, remained a steady seller, though by the 2010s they were less about innovation and more about familiarity. People bought them because they were Calvin Klein, not because they said anything new. Fragrance was even more important. CK1, Obsession, Eternity, names born in the 1990s, still dominated counters in the decades that followed. Flankers and limited editions kept the shelves refreshed, but the core scents never really left. For many, Calvin Klein became a perfume house first, a fashion brand second. The strategy kept the name everywhere, but being everywhere isn't the same as being relevant. In the years after Raf's departure, Calvin Klein was easy to find but hard to define. The campaigns no longer shocked or stirred debate. They simply recycled an old formula, relying on nostalgia rather than invention. And that's where the brand stayed, alive, profitable but hollow. A business running on recognition, waiting for something to give it purpose again. For years, Calvin Klein's absence from the runway was a glaring gap. Competitors continued to evolve, but Calvin Klein felt stuck in a loop of fragrances, underwear, and recycled campaigns. That's why, when PVH announced in 2024 that the collection line would return, it was framed as a comeback, the brand's chance to reclaim its high fashion credibility. The choice of creative director was telling. Veronica Leoni wasn't a celebrity name, but inside the industry, she had serious weight. She had worked under Phoebe Philo at Celine, absorbed Jill Sanders' discipline, shaped outerwear at Moncler, and most recently designed for the Row. Her reputation was for clarity, structure, and modern minimalism, qualities that echoed Calvin Klein at its strongest. Her debut, staged in New York in early 2025, was more than just another show. It was the first time a Calvin Klein collection had appeared on the runway since Raf Simons' short-lived tenure ended in 2018. Expectations were enormous. Critics wanted to see whether the brand could capture the electricity of its past, while PVH wanted proof that high fashion could once again justify its investment. The results were polished but cautious. Reviewers praised the tailoring, the clean silhouettes, and the sense of refinement that Leoni brought. Some described it as minimalist tailoring with a hint of severity, disciplined and modern, though still missing the provocative edge Calvin was once known for. There was a clear respect for the house codes, sharp coats, architectural lines, and a muted sensuality that nodded to the Klein aesthetic without simply replicating it. But what was missing was harder to ignore. Calvin Klein, at its peak, had always flirted with danger. The Brooke Shields campaign, the heroin chic ads of the 90s, even the stripped-down minimalism of the 2000s, they all had a sense of risk. Leoni's collection didn't court controversy. It was confident, wearable, and modern, but it stopped short of seduction. The reviews reflected that tension. Some called it a promising reset, a long overdue return to relevance. Others noted the absence of the brand's old sexual charge, describing the collection as refined but safe. For a label that built its empire on provocation, safe was hardly the word you wanted attached to a comeback. Still, the debut mattered. For the first time in years, Calvin Klein was back on the calendar, part of the high fashion conversation again. Leoni gave the brand direction and focus, something it had sorely lacked since Calvin himself stepped away. Whether her vision can evolve into something bold enough to recapture the cultural spark is another question. But at least, for now, Calvin Klein had taken a step out of autopilot and back onto the runway. For PVH, Calvin Klein's runway return wasn't just about image. It was about proving the brand could matter again. But the numbers tell a more complicated story. In 2024, PVH reported a 5% sales decline. By early 2025, they projected flat to slightly positive growth, better than Wall Street expected, but hardly a comeback. Shares spiked, yet the optimism was fragile. Inflation weighed on North America, consumer confidence was slipping, and China, once seen as a growth engine, had turned hostile. Beijing blacklisted PVH in early 2025, citing damaging actions without detail. For a brand that had once earned 16% of its profit there, the risk was enormous. So PVH leaned on the one thing Calvin Klein still does better than almost anyone: cultural noise. The campaigns of 2024 and 2025 stacked celebrity firepower. Jeremy Allen White stripped down to his underwear. K-pop star Mingyu fronted denim. Bad Bunny lit up global feeds. They went viral, fueled sales in core categories, and reminded younger audiences why the Calvin logo still carries weight. But spectacle is not the same as substance. The collection relaunch under Veronica Leoni showed the company's ambition to be more than jeans and underwear again. The problem is that most of the revenue still comes from those basics. For all the fanfare, Calvin Klein remains a brand suspended between two worlds: the mall and the runway, nostalgia and reinvention. And that's the tension as we look forward. Can Calvin Klein, in the hands of a new creative director, rebuild the daring that once defined it, the provocation, the the sleek seduction, the confidence that turned Calvin Klein into a global empire? Or will it stay stuck in the middle, a logo brand that can sell products but never again set the agenda? Calvin Klein has the name, the reach, and the history. What it doesn't have yet is clarity. Whether this reset becomes a true revival or just another cycle of noise will decide if Calvin Klein can reclaim its cultural power or remain an echo of what it used to be. So what do you think? Has Calvin finally found its way back? Or is the heart of the brand still flatlining? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.